Back again. Same shirts, same background, same setting, really, because we're just continuing with these 4 different episodes, one after another. As I introduce my good friend over here, Thomas. Thomas from Germany, you have been so good and so kind to come and help us and join with us. Thank you. This is our 4th episode, and we've done boom, 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 one after another. You not only did a great introduction to the German school, you then went and did a terrific unpacking of Christoph Luxemburg and his book, this one right here, that has been so pivotal in understanding the makeup of the Quran. And then we went into the Proto-Quran in the last episode, and now we're going into the writers of the Quran. And you're going to give us a bombshell. You're going to tell us something I've never heard before. I don't think anybody who's on my channel has heard this before. Maybe those who have read or are familiar with the German school will know what it is, but this is going to be a bombshell concerning where you think the Quran actually was derived, where it came from. So over to you. Go ahead and help us. And we're sitting here on the edge of our seats, as we say in English, on pins and needles, wanting to know who or just say who were the writers of the Quran.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Jay. I'll go straight into my presentation. Right. So, who were the writers of the Quran? Where were they? What can we tell about them? So basically, first, based on everything we've heard before, there are some facts we know about the writers of the Quran. So we know they use both Arabic and Aramaic. They were still fluent in Aramaic, because it was also the liturgical language of the time, just like Latin was in the Catholic Church in the West. So in Syria and this whole region, Aramaic would have been the liturgical language. We also know, based on the reading of the Quran, that they were often very polemic against Trinitarian views. And in particular, it seems like the writers of the Quran attack the Church of the East a lot. So that's also known as the Nestorian Church, which did adopt the Nicene Creed in 410 at their own council of Ctesiphon. And since these polemics are so central to this proto-Quran, we are safe to assume that this was an Eastern Christian splinter group. So they were a minority who were sort of arguing and like verbally fighting against like the big Church of the East, the Nestorian Church, who was Trinitarian. Sometimes we also see attacks against the Greek Church instead. Sometimes we see attacks against the Monophysite Ghassanids. So the Ghassanids were an Arab tribe who converted to Monophysite Christianity centuries before. So we can tell from that this is sort of the context that these writers lived in, right? So they lived somewhere where there's a strong Nestorian church, but also other elements are present. And of course, the people who wrote the Quran believed that they were the only ones who lived in accordance with Scripture, as opposed to all the other groups in the Quran. So now, where was it written? Right? So we know that Quran must have been written in a place where Arab Christians lived, where there was a dominant Nestorian church, where we would have Monophysite Christians, we had Gnostics, Buddhists, and Zoroastrians. And that's last time we saw all those influences, right? So obviously those influences came into the Quran because of the writers were exposed to those traditions. It also has to be a place that matches plants, fruits, gardens, etc. mentioned in the Quran. And it needs to be consistent with the language of the Quran. And the language is that of Eastern Syria, Eastern Palestine, like today's Jordan, maybe Iraq, the Iraq-Syrian border region, somewhere there. So we can actually narrow down what language they use. All right. But now, so traditionally, it's Mecca and Medina, but they actually match none of the criteria above, right? So, well, maybe there were a couple of Arab Christians, but definitely not the number that would have been needed to justify writing election. There was no Nestorian church. There were no Monophysites, no Gnostics, no Buddhists, no Zoroastrians in Mecca and Medina. They don't have any of the plants, fruits, and gardens described in the Quran. And of course, they had a different language. So instead, everything points to Eastern Persia. And I think this is where probably some of the viewers will think, wait a minute, Eastern Persia? Or didn't you just say it's the language instead of Eastern Syria, maybe Western Iraq? So how come you say Eastern Persia? Well, the reason is because under Sassanid rule, for centuries, there were lots and lots of deportations. So what the Sassanid rulers would typically do is they would often build completely new cities which were empty, and then they would raid cities in the Byzantine Empire or the Roman Empire before that, and deport hundreds of thousands of people to move them into their new cities usually somewhere in the east of Persia. So and we know that this is how Christianity first got into Persia. So by the time the Quran was written, Christianity was actually spreading fast in Persia. Persia was being on the verge of being Christianized, but the original seed was planted by people who were deported. And we know from the records that under King Shapur I alone, hundreds of thousands were deported from Syria, Cilicia, and Cappadocia. And he reigned from 240 to 270 AD. So that's long in the past, even from the perspective of the writers of the Quran. And then it went on. Throughout the centuries, whenever there was a war between the Sassanids and the Romans or the Byzantines, there would be deportations. And again, another Persian king who had deported hundreds of thousands was Khosrow I, who reigned from 531 to 579. And he, for instance, deported almost all of Antioch. And by this time, all of the people who were deported were basically Christians. So when we go back to the 3rd centuries, there would have been Christians there, but they weren't necessarily the majority. But by the 6th century, they were all Christians who were deported. So now we have Arab Christians living in Persian exile, sometimes far in the east. And they compared themselves to the Jews of the Old Testament. And again, we can also see that in the Quran. So, for example, Khosrow I, who I just mentioned, who deported so many people in the 6th century, he is called Pharaoh by the writers of the Quran. We have also other evidence that points to Eastern Persia. So, for example, the coins that call Jesus Abdallah, that servant of God, which is again a very central part of this anti-Trinitarian theology. Because by servant of God, what you're saying is that he's not God himself, he's serving God. So he is not divine. So we've coins with this Abdallah motto, and those coins first appear in Eastern Persia, and then slowly they migrate sort of from east to west as the religion spreads. But it starts out in the east, and similar for coins with Muhammad, those come up first in the east and then slowly migrate to the west. Then when we look at Abd al-Malik, he's typically called, when you read the full name, Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, so son of Marwan. However, when you look at the oldest coins, and again, you will not find this ibn there. So it will just be Abd al-Malik Marwan. So it's not the son of Marwan. Abd al-Malik is the Marwan. So he's basically the leader of the people of Marv, which is what we nowadays call Merv, which you see the arrow points to on the slide. So that's the assumption where Abd al-Malik is from, and also where the writers of the Quran are from, and where the Quran was originally written, because it's Abd al-Malik who also popularized the Quran. Right? Before Abd al-Malik, the Quran was a very local phenomenon, but after Abd al-Malik, it was everywhere. And since he came from Merv, that is also supporting this idea. And I think this is what you said, which will definitely surprise people, because that's something I hadn't heard outside of the people from Inara either.
Now, for people who are wondering where Merv is, if you look on a map today, it's not called Merv. you need to go look at Turkmenistan, and you need to, today it's called Mary or Bayramali. Bayram, they're different names. So it's a different name today. So don't look for the word M-E-R-V. It won't be there. It'll be called M-A-R-Y in modern maps today.
Yeah. But they still pronounce it as Malv or something along those lines. So it's just they use a Y letter, but it's pronounced the same way as it was.
I'm just saying for Google Map, I know people are going to say, I couldn't find Merv, it doesn't exist. Just so that to obviate that, it is called M-A-R-Y on the Google Map today, just so people can find it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that actually, so we know from all those influences that we have, like Buddhist, Zoroastrian, Monophysites, and so on, that the city the Quran was written in must have been a big population center. So again, Mecca and Medina, those weren't population centers. Those somewhere in the middle of the desert, hardly anybody there. Whereas Merv was a major city of the Persian Empire. So it was located on the Silk Road. So you had a lot of business going through there. It's at an oasis. Again, plants, fruits, and so on. And that's also why you would get Buddhist influences. There was actually a very large Buddhist community in Merv because of its location on the Silk Road and all the trade that was going on. You obviously had Zoroastrian influences there because it was Persia. You did have lots of Christians because of the deportations. The Nestorian Church had recently elevated Merv to the seat of a metropolitan bishop. So that's what, for instance, the Catholic Church is now called an archbishop. So that could be, for instance, like cause of some disagreements, like now, because now the church was taking root there and importing its hierarchy and so on, which the writers of the Quran wouldn't have liked. In Merv was actually so big, it was important. It was briefly the seat of the entire Islamic Caliphate in the 9th century. And it was one of the largest cities in the world and predominantly Christian and Buddhist before it was destroyed by the Mongols in 1221. Exactly. So lots and lots of arguments that support the idea of Merv as the origin, and that's also the consensus that is emerging out of this Inara group. So they see Merv as the most likely candidate. It's to be fair, it's not the only one. So there is some degree of uncertainty, but the other one they have would be in the area around the city of Shiraz. So that's called Persis. Here we also have many of the elements that would which we would need for the Quran to have originated there. It's not quite as good as Merv, so that's why the consensus is Merv, but it could also be this Persis region around Shiraz. Well,
this is new for us. This is good. We're going to have some comeback on this. Continue on.
Yeah. I wouldn't expect anything less. Okay, so now that we have a rough idea of where the Quran would have been written, now the question is when. And now we really get into speculative territory because obviously we only have circumstantial evidence. And it's also obvious that the Quran contains very, very old elements, right? For instance, we've seen some of those Gnostic texts that were from the 3rd century, but then obviously the Jewish texts were from the 2nd century. And then when we look at all those Old Testament episodes that are in the Quran, we're even before then. So it doesn't even really make sense to ask when was it written. So that's why I've slightly reformulated it and asked when was it compiled. And now the people of Inara, they are smart enough to not talk in specific dates, but I've sort of read between the lines and drawn my own conclusions. And the way I see it, it's most likely, so the core of the Quran, the oldest parts, would have been written roughly between the years 550 and 600 AD. So that would be like the oldest third, roughly, of the Quran.
So just so we're getting to you, when you say the core or the oldest, you're talking about the lectionary part.
Yes, exactly. So what we talked last time.
Okay, so what we were talking in the last episode. So these ones that Christoph Luxemburg is finding, the ones that Gunther Luning are finding, this is the part that you're talking about. That's the core that was around in 550 to 600.
Yeah, and we also find obviously Christian elements later, like for example, those what we talked last time about those passages where the Quran makes sure to tell the readers that it's only affirming scripture. That's still obviously coming from a very Christian tradition, but that's later. But here, this oldest part, was roughly written between 550 and 600. So in like how did we come to this conclusion? Well, first I just mentioned that there was a new metropolitan bishop in Merv, so that he, I think, took office around 550, and it's likely that it was written afterwards. Also, we know that the Quran talks about Khosrow I as Pharaoh, so it must have been written either during his reign or maybe shortly afterwards. And his reign lasts until 571. And we can be fairly certain that it must have been written while the Persian or the Sassanid Empire rather was still in full swing. So before the end of the Sassanid Empire, while they were in exile and were sort of yearning for their own exodus, which they would have called their hijra, which would be the return to the land of their fathers and forefathers, with all the holy sites and so on. So probably before the war with the Byzantine Empire started, it brought down the Persian Empire. That's why I put it in roughly between 550 and 600 AD. But as you can already see, that's hinging on a lot of ifs, right? So if, for instance, if this wasn't written in Merv, then it may change, right? It might have been written earlier then. But so that's the best guess I could come up with. So what we can also say is that the Quran was probably transcribed under Abd al-Malik, so into Arabic. So it was the language didn't change, but before we already said in the second video we did talking about Christoph Luxemburg's thesis that originally the Quran was written in Aramaic script, and under Abd al-Malik at the later. So it could have happened a bit before him, but probably under Abd al-Malik, it was transcribed into Arabic and then spread widely across the lands. And indeed, actually, I don't have the quote with me right now, but I found something also recently. I read something, a quote from Abd al-Malik, wherein he says that he is afraid to die during Ramadan because that's when he was born, that's when he was elected caliph, and that's when he collected the Quran. So he uses the word collected the Quran, which sort of indicates that he definitely had something to do with the spread of it. So as we said, the core already existed long before Abd al-Malik, but I think once Abd al-Malik is done, sort of then we have almost the entire Quran. So that's sort of the period where we get most of the text. So a third exists before 600, and then the remaining 2/3 get added over the next century. So here, I've tried to visualize the connections of those groups. And what you can see here are the various different forms of Christianity as they existed in the Middle and Near East. So I've ignored all the minor offshoots and things that weren't in this region. And it basically starts with Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians and then branches off. And the way to read this is, so you see obviously those different lines and they're connected by those gray lines that flow between those different boxes. So those gray lines, those are not people. So for instance, if you look at this Aryan box here, we have one line coming from the Catholic side and one from the Syrian side. This doesn't mean that the Catholics and Syrian Christians came together and formed Arianism. It means that the foundational ideas of Arianism are based on those two traditions. And in the case of Arianism, it was very close to this Syrian tradition, but further away from Catholics. So that's why it's close to the Syrian one. And then when you look later on, the Nestorian Church has a similar origin story. So they also come from both sides, but now we are a lot closer to the Catholic tradition than to the Syrian tradition. So and that's how you read this graph. I'm just going quickly through those different sort of, if you want to call faiths. I don't think we need to go into detail here, and hopefully by the end of this video series, you'll understand this much better. But basically what we have here at the very bottom is are the Ebionites. So those were those Jewish Christians which, for instance, Patrizia Koenig is suspected as the originators of the Quran, and also von Harnack. Those were first and foremost Jews, but Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. He was a man, just like in the Syrian tradition. So their theology was very similar to what we just talked about, the theology of the writers of the Quran would have been like. And those are these Syrian anti-Trinitarian Christians. So their Christology was virtually identical with that of the Ebionites, but they didn't see themselves as Jews. So they saw themselves first and foremost as Christians. And they came from so physically they were Gentile Christians, but they took some ideas from the Jewish side as well, or actually a lot of ideas from the Jewish side. So they were quite close to the Ebionites in their theology, but they weren't Jews. So they were sort of, there was a hard cut between them. Although it's likely that the Ebionites slowly got assimilated into this strand, right? So they disappear. Actually, they almost disappear very early on. So they don't last that long, but they are attested to until the 7th century, but in very tiny groups. Then we have those anti-Trinitarian Syrians, which we already talked about. Now the pink line I called Catholic. I could have called it proto-Orthodox or Orthodox or whatever, but I think they might have given some false ideas because there are other Orthodox churches that wouldn't fall in here. So that's sort of the tradition we now today know as, in the West at least, as Christianity. So in the East, it's Monophysite. So they sort of split off somewhere between the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Chalcedon. That's when this belief evolved. The main difference between Monophysite and Catholic belief is the Catholics believed Jesus had two natures, one divine, one human. The Monophysites believed Jesus had one nature, but it was both divine and human. So that was the big disagreement there, and why they split off. And today, like the Oriental Orthodox churches and the Coptic Church in Egypt are still Monophysites. And the Nestorians, that would be then later the national church of the Sassanid Empire, still exists today, although it's now tiny. I think there's now, 100,000 or 200,000 members. That the people that formed the Nestorian church actually came from the Syrian anti-Trinitarian background, but they took like 2 or 3 steps towards the Catholic side, which was back then the religion of the Byzantine Empire, and had a lot of influenced a lot by Greek philosophy and Greek thought. And the Nestorians sort of basically they took the theology of the Catholics but gave it a Syrian spin, if you will. And now you see it now here very late in the 9th century, Islam comes up, and that's because I would consider the writers of the Quran still to be Christians, not Muslims, but it was a long process. So we saw that towards the end of the 6th century, the Quran was written. That's where this gray line starts. And then over this long period until the 9th century, sort of slowly moves away and moves into its own thing and becomes like a completely separate religion eventually. And it's also when then the Syrian anti-Trinitarian Christianity more or less disappears and it gets sucked up by Islam, if you will. So this is the theory I'm proposing. Again, this will probably be a bit difficult to grasp now, but we'll get into more details as this series goes along. So a summary because now at the end of all the videos we've done, of all those 4 videos, we can say that critical Quran studies have begun in the 19th century. We learned that the Quran is written in a mixed Syriac and Arabic language. That this led to many misreadings, the so-called dark passages, because it's now only read in Arabic, not in this mixed language. We've learned that the Quran is at its core a Christian lectionary, so that's this proto-Quran. It was written by Arabs in Persian exile. The Quran has an anti-Trinitarian Christology, and it was compiled over a lengthy period. I've now written here between the 6th and 11th century. Now that's the extreme end. So I would say by the year 700, we more or less have most of the Quran. Some of it would still come later. Some of it would be removed. There would still be some changes, and then the diacritical marks have actually not been finalized as late as the 11th century. So there were still changes made to the dots, but that's over the last couple of centuries, it was mainly the dots that were still unclear, but the text would have been there. Yeah.
Okay. Well, these have been 4 excellent episodes. What an introduction. Thanks so much. This last one I knew would be a humdinger. I'm sure people are a little surprised because you're not only saying that it is way over to the east, but it's way up to the northeast that the Quran was written.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. And no one, I would have never thought Merv. I would never have thought Turkmenistan. But when you look at all together, now what's fascinating is, as you were saying that, I've just done these episodes we're looking through many different categories, many different genres to confront the standard Islamic narrative. And we've looked at the mosques, that Dan Gibson's material on the mosques and the Qiblas. That was one of the earliest things we looked at. We looked at the coins. Volker Pop has really helped us with that. And Odon and I did those 2 series on the coins and really unpacked it. You can see then we've Ilstad, who comes from the Scandinavian country, who did the work on these inscriptions, the Nabatean Aramaic inscriptions that from up the north. And then we started looking at the paintings, and this is what Mel brought into the paintings, where you see the whole evolution of Islam. And in those paintings, what was fascinating, by the 9th century, we're getting all these Chinese characters in the paintings. These are Islamic paintings, and they have Chinese features, and they make a distinction between the Chinese. In some cases, they don't make a distinction. Even paintings of Muhammad, that whole series we did on Muhammad, looking at all the paintings, a whole nother genre. Now this makes sense from what you're telling me, because if the Quran is written up there, and if that is where really the book is being, well, when we're saying the Quran, the 2/3 of the Quran is written up there. The 1/3 comes from much further west in Syria and also in Iraq. That is the lectionaries. That's where much of the Byzantine world was, and that's where the lectionaries are being tabulated, and that's probably happening in 550 to 600, the dates you're giving. 500 to 600, that initial third, the oldest part, the oldest categories. And that's why now the Birmingham folios that they found in 2015 now make sense, because remember, those are 3 stories that are pre-Islamic, pre-Quranic, pre-Muhammad. They all are stories, well, of the 7 sleepers, and they're also the story of the James the Lesser. That's from 125 AD and also 500 AD. And then, of course, the story of Moses, which we know is from the Old Testament. None of these are Islamic. They are all borrowed. Like everything Islam does, it borrows. And as you've been saying in these episodes, it looks like they borrowed lots of lectionaries written in Syriac Aramaic, or Aramaic Syriac, or Syriac Aramaic. And that's why Luxemburg's book has been so good. Gunther Lulling's book, these 2 books have been pivotal to really help us and see how that a good number of them were also written, borrowed from hymns, Syriac hymns, Christian hymns. But when you stop and ask, and this is what I'm going to run with you on this one, because I'm not going to. Let's see if others can dispute you. When you put together and unpack all of these influences, and you did that, you said there was Jewish influences, there's Christian influences, there's Persian influences, there are Buddhist influences, and that got my hackles up when you said that. And there's an awful lot of Gnostic influences. Well, with all these influences, with all these stories, with all these references, with all these borrowings from those 5 different influences, where do you find a place where all those 5 people are? Obviously not down in the Hijaz. Obviously not in Mecca and Medina, in Central Arabia. But Merv? Possibly, because that would explain the Buddhist influences. And there's a whole other thing that you are going to unpack later on in other ones coming up, where you're going to look at the Buddhist influence and see this could really only exist because the Buddhist influence, except for the emissaries that come to Syria, almost all of them would have been in Merv. Why? Because that's the Silk Road. That's the trade route. And that would be the cosmopolitan, the city, such a big city that it would have a melting pot where there would be, I'm sure, there would be seminaries, Gnostic seminaries, Nestorian seminaries, and certainly there'd be an awful lot of Buddhist uh, uh, discussion and debates. And that makes sense then why the Quran has borrowed so much. So that would support what you're saying. It's the right place at the right time, doing with the right mix and with the right people. And that would then make us help us understand why so much of the Quran includes these influences.
I think what people often didn't take into account were just how massive those deportations were. And they were ongoing throughout the centuries. So that's how we end up with Arabs all the way up in Merv and everywhere throughout the Persian Empire, basically living there in exile.
Yeah, I mean, you said that in fact the entire city of Antioch was taken in as a whole and moved up there. And it's okay. Well, let's go ahead and put that out there. Merv, what is called Mary today. You'll see it on the Google Maps. Turkmenistan. Let's put that under our hat and let's see if this is correct. Now, this is what the Inada group have come to their conclusions. It's not Thomas's conclusions. It's the Inada group, but he is speaking for the Inada group. These are the German scholars. You've heard it first from Thomas here. I'm sorry, Thomas there. And now you've now heard it from both of us. Let's see how you can react. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of reaction. We want to see people engage with this. Don't walk away from it, Muslims. Don't sit there and call us all kinds of names. Look at the historical record. We have said it over and over again. We're not interested in you just mimicking what you have been told your whole life from the 9th and 10th centuries. And as Mel and I are finding out, they're not even from the 9th and 10th centuries. They're actually from the 16th century, redacted to the 9th and 10th centuries, which is redacted back onto the 7th century. But you know what Thomas has done? He has not wasted your time with the 9th and 10th century. He has been speaking from in this case, the 6th and the 7th century, back to the 500s, 550, and he's going into the 7th century. So he's really going back to what we've asked every one of our scholars to do. Go back to where Islam began. Go back to not only where it began, but when it began. Get us in the right century and get us in the right environment. Now, I would have never expected it to be way up in Merv. I thought it was all coming out of either Hira, which is today Kufa, or Ctesiphon, which is today Baghdad, or up here in the northwest, Damascus, which is in Syria. Those are the cities I would have expected because that's where the political powerhouses were. The political powerhouses with the Umayyads up in Syria and the Abbasids over here in Ctesiphon, later become Baghdad. But you're saying no. We need to look at the sea where all this mass migrations was, where there were not migrations. These were not migrations. These were enforced migrations up to the city of Mur. So let's put that under our hat. Let's see if we can find more substantiation. And I'm putting this out there for not just the Muslims, I'm also for those of you who are sitting on the fence and those of you who've been really helping us out with a lot of your reference points and giving us articles in other areas. Come back and see if you can support this. Let's see if you're able to. And if not, then tell us why not. Go ahead. What did you want to say?
I wanted to say that actually there were also voluntary migrations, so that did happen as well. But we will see that again in a later video. And there's one more thing, and that's what you said. The power centers were more in the West, but you're now already talking about the Caliphate, right? And now, but when you look at the Quran, it's pretty clear that at least the core of it must have been compiled earlier. So you have to go way before the Caliphate into the end of the 6th century. And that's where you would find the Arabs that fit the description that would be up in Merv. And then only later you would find them in Damascus and in Baghdad.
The fact that Abd al-Malik Marwan from the Marwan family is the name for Merv. The Marwan is in his name, that he came from up that area. And he is the one that really is the Arab reformer. He is the one that introduces us to the first Quranic text on the Dome of the Rock and on the coins and on the protocols. He is hugely influential as to who this Islam finally becomes. If he's from that city, then of course that also fits your paradigm. Thank you so much, Thomas. This has been great. We've did 4 sessions all in one afternoon. We're still wearing the same shirts, and we're still coming to fascinating conclusions because we're just now starting to get into what and how did Islam really begin. You've really helped us with the Quran with these episodes. Thank you so much for unpacking Luxembourg, And thank you for the background you've given us to Luling and to Cologne and all the others. These great German school, not all of them are Germans, but they're all doing their work in Germany. And thank you so much for representing the INATA, the group that we have not seen represented yet. And you've been a great candidate to do just that. God bless you. And continue to do your research and continue to come on board. And we'll continue to do more of these episodes so people can engage with it. All right, folks, you've heard it now from the lips of Thomas. Now you do engage with him. And let's hear your feedback. This is Jay here in the United States. And Thomas, they're in Germany. In fact, it's almost like 2 o'clock in the morning for you. So you really stayed up early. What time is it there?
Actually, it's 3:30. So
that's 3 in the morning. God bless you. We got to put this guy to bed. But before we do that, let's all give him a hand and give him an applaud. Thank you so much. Jay and Thomas, over and out.